Welcome to our podcast, Raising Bigs. This podcast is an ongoing conversation between myself and my young adult son. And today we have invited a guest. We're ready and willing to talk about all the things families might experience in their lives and relationships, both as parents and young adults, from teens to 20 somethings, the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. In this episode, we're talking about LGBTQ plus identities. Our guest is my oldest son, Sawyer. He's also Cade's big brother. Whether your family is navigating LGBTQ plus identity issues or you're just trying to gain understanding in order to be a more supportive human, we hope you find value in today's discussion. Let's dive in. I'm Marcy and I'm the mom.
I'm Cade and I'm her kid. Welcome to Raising Big, Sawyer. Sawyer, please tell us a little bit of why the topic of LGBTQ plus identities is an important topic for us to discuss on Raising Bigs, and why you think it should be a more open conversation between bigs and parents.
Yeah, and thank you so much again for having me on Raising Bigs. I think this topic of LGBTQ identities is important to talk about on Raising Bigs because it is not only something that impacts a lot of us here within our society today, but also it can be a really challenging time for both kids, bigs, and their parents. And as family members, it's really important and can sometimes be challenging to be able to really kind of show up and support someone in your life who's struggling or navigating through aspects of their own identity. So I'm really excited to be here and to dive into these topics today.
And so we're kind of coming into this with the frame of reference that it could be either the child, the grown adult child, or the parent dealing with an LGBTQ plus identity issue, right? So it can go both ways, whether it be a parent identifying themselves as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, or it could be a child doing the same. So let's talk about opening a conversation with a child or parent and kind of what that coming out process or lack thereof may or may not look like. So Sawyer, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think the coming out process looks different for everyone, or I love how you mentioned the lack thereof. I think especially for the youngest of us, our Gen Alpha and our Gen Z bigs, they're really starting to come into their own. And what we've been seeing not only is that a larger number of Generation Z is self-identifying as a member of the LGBTQ community, but also they're kind of more and more coming to the terms with the process of like, hey, I don't even need to come out as something that isn't necessarily straight. And so I think it's really important that when we're thinking about the coming out process or even just starting that conversation, for parents, it's really to kind of keep those areas and lines of communication open. So often for members of the LGBTQ community, your family is either the most supporting or can also cause some of the most anxiety. And so really being able to kind of be a supportive place for your child to land. But I will also say too that it's really important as a parent that you never rush your child through that process of coming out or really identifying who they are. As children and bigs kind of come into their own and really learn who they are as humans, there can be moments where they're not even 100% sure about who they are themselves, let alone being able to articulate that to their parent.
For sure. And I think, the coming out process in that conversation is unique to every individual and every family. There's some people who feel the need to, have a coming out whole event. There's other people who don't. There's people who, are maybe they already know that their parents won't be accepting to it, or their child won't be accepting to it. And so maybe they, just choose not to share that part of their life with them. I think that's something that you have to identify, based on your situation. And also, like you said, especially with younger people, I think people are coming into their identities at a younger age now. And a lot of times too, the way you feel when you're 12 is not the way you feel when you're 16, is not the way you feel when you're 20. So I think that's important. And, kind of like you said, Mom, earlier too, for parents coming out, sometimes when you're 40, you have a realization that, you haven't been living life the way you're meant to. So I think it's important just to have that open thought process and being understanding of all of that.
Yeah, I think society and acceptance has come a long way. And I think there were a lot of people of my generation or even generations older than myself that they just did what was accepted by society, which was to get married to someone of the opposite sex and create a family. And then they find themselves years later living out of alignment with who they truly are. And so that's why you see instances of people getting divorced. And then before you know it, they are in a same sex relationship, right? And it
Mhm.
takes a lot of people by surprise. They're like, well, you were married and you had a husband and now you have a wife. And how does all that work? Looks very different, I think, than it does today. Like where you said, Kate, a lot of people are coming to those realizations earlier and I think are more comfortable in living a life in alignment with who they truly are at much younger ages. I think the youngest among us like don't feel like they need society's permission to be who they truly are, and that in my estimation is a beautiful thing. When I said the lack of coming out, like I mean I have had conversations with people, whose kids have come to them and I've been like, well, do I go around telling people, oh, I'm straight? Do I
Mhm.
have to go announce that when I walk into a room? No. Therefore, if they're not comfortable having to announce that, or if they don't feel the need to, should they have to? Absolutely not, right? Like it is just a part of who they are. They will tell who they want to
Mhm.
tell and who they're comfortable telling. And some people don't need to know, like, is it really relevant to the
Mhm.
situation that they're in? So I also think an important piece to address before we move on to the next comment is I think it's really important for parents, and maybe it goes the other way. I don't have experience. I have two heterosexual parents, so I don't know how a parent who identifies as LGBTQ plus would feel about their child outing them to someone else.
Mhm.
But as a parent, it's important that you don't out your child to other people in your life. That is their story to tell. So I think it's really important to make sure that
Mhm.
you are not engaging in that type of behavior in an attempt potentially to get your own support, or even in an honest attempt to try to get your child's support, but you're crossing a line
Mhm.
there that doesn't need to be crossed.
I
So
also think sometimes I think, outing someone in their sexuality or their identity is definitely a very sensitive topic. But my opinion on that is having the fear of outing someone in a way inadvertently feeds into the mindset
mm,
that heterosexuality is normal. So if you're, having a conversation about your child with your friend and they're a girl and they say, "Oh, well, little Susie's girlfriend, blah, 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 blah." And I think, but that's a conversation you need to have with your child of whether or not they're comfortable with you telling people that.
mhm,
And if they are, I don't think that there is a point in trying to hide it because, again, that feeds into the
mhm,
mindset that, not being heterosexual, there's something wrong or there's something that needs to be secret about it. So that's something that, from my perspective, with outing someone, like I said, I think that my opinion is not the norm. I think that a lot of people are a little more careful about it. But for me personally, I think that that's something that you just kind of have to have that conversation about. And it, again, goes with coming out. It's up to each
yeah.
individual and what they're comfortable sharing.
So having that conversation with your child before you go do it,
Hmm.
and if they are okay with it, then going ahead and sharing that as
For
you will.
sure.
I think also important though as a parent to consider who you're sharing it with. Like,
Hmm.
Brene Brown said years and years ago, and it's one of the best things I've ever heard, is that not everyone has the right to hear your story.
Hmm.
So I think just being careful and conscious of who it is that you're sharing your story with, so that you're not subjecting yourself or your child to influences that maybe are not going to embrace them or treat them kindly. So, Sawyer,
For
anything
sure.
to add to that?
No, I think you're kind of on the right track here, right? Of really talking about that psychological and the social components that really come into coming out, right? And what it really means to be a member of the
Hmm.
LGBTQ community. I feel very fortunate that I now live in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, where it is not only very normalized within our society out here on the West Coast, but it is very accepted to, be open and be out as a member of the LGBTQ community. I've also spent portions of my life in places like Kansas and Nebraska, where it is not always safe to be able to be out, right? And I mean that both in a physical sense, it is not physically safe.
Mm.
I also mean that in a social sense, and it is not socially safe to be out. And so there are components that you really have to take into account, not only when you yourself as an adult or a parent might be navigating through your own identity or your child's identity, but also, as a child, being really thoughtful and understanding of the fact that, as you do come out or as you share these aspects of you, that there may be places and there may be people that aren't accepting of you. And so
Hmm.
how are you then able to utilize those people and those communities that do respect and uplift you kind of throughout those times of difficulty?
Hmm.
And I think as a parent, especially if it is a parent who has zero experience, right? It doesn't have any friends who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, hasn't had any experience with that. When you have a child coming to you questioning their own identity, or maybe they're absolutely certain of who they are, knowing that it can morph and change over time as your child is learning who they are and as they're aging and growing. And, there may be kids when they're younger that have an idea that maybe they're not heterosexual like mom and dad, or they're not, boy crazy like their big sister, or whatever that might be. Like there's a lot of different things that happen that give them the inkling that maybe they don't fall into the heterosexual classification, but they take time to figure it out with some
Mhm.
people. And I think being a parent it's important to be accepting of where your child is on that journey and not try to say, well, I need a label. I need to know
Mhm.
how you identify yourself. Therefore, so it makes it easier for me to talk about, right? It's not
Mhm.
that cut and dried. It's not that clean and easy. So I think it's
Yeah.
important for parents to know that.
And I think also it's important for whoever is, having having this LGBTQ plus identity, that you don't have to identify as anything. You don't have to say I'm gay or I'm bisexual or I'm
Hmm.
trans or whatever. You can just be yourself. And
You.
if that means that you're a boy and you like boys, that's cool. That means if you're a girl and you like trees, cool. Like whatever it is that you like, that's just, what it is for you. So I think that it's important. I think, especially now that, years have gone on, I know a couple years ago, it was very kind of just a societal pressure of, oh, are you gay or are you bisexual or are you straight or are you trans or what are you? And now you have men who are straight but like to just dress as women because that's what they're comfortable, or dress in stereotypical women clothing, but they identify as straight. And that's, so I think that now there's just such a big spectrum of, sometimes there's not an identity to identify with, and that's okay, and you can just be yourself and go on about your day.
Well, and I think so often as human beings, right, we have this kind of compulsory feeling to want to put
Mhm.
a label on things, to put a name
Hmm.
on something. And so it kind of makes our brain freak out a little bit when we can't name something like, oh, that is a dog, that is a
Uh-huh.
person, like not being able to name something can be challenging. But I think it's also important to recognize, as much as it is for parents a challenge and it can be hard to not have a quote unquote label for your kid, right? Imagine how that feels for your child not to have an identity for themselves and how jarring that can feel. And the kind of like just weird griminess that can
Mhm.
feel to kind of exist throughout that space. And so, as we are kind of talking about how important it is to allow folks to kind of identify themselves and kind of come out in their own process, I think it's interesting to think about, and I'd be interested, Mom, to hear your perspective on this about what does it mean and how can parents help their kids navigate through that process of identifying themselves and really coming into that acceptance piece, right? As they
Mhm.
kind of have different parts of their identity that start rising to the surface.
I think it's coming at it from a place of curiosity and trying to get to
Hmm.
know your child and who they are, because it is revealed over time, right? And it is theirs to discover, and you are learning secondhand. And so I think it's important to remember that, we still, as a society, you get the ultrasound report and they tell you you're having a boy or a girl. And then there's these big gender reveals, and is it a boy or is it a girl? And as a society, there's still things like that very much, speaking to the categorization, right, that goes in our brain. We try to make things fit. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that it is a journey. It is a journey on that your child is on to self-discovery, or it is a journey that your parent is on to self-discovery,
Hmm.
and to just be accepting of the fact that it's a journey, and journeys take time, right? And there is no end destination, right? We are all
Hmm.
morphing and growing and evolving as humans. And so I think that acceptance piece and that coming at it from curiosity and being willing to go ride the waves, right? Like being willing to change. And I know I have had friends who have gone through all kinds of LGBTQ plus scenarios, gender
Hmm.
identity issues, and some of the hardest things, right, are the changing of pronouns, the changing of names. Like those things are hard for parents, especially because the parents, right, they picked the name for their child.
Hmm.
And so I think that that category of change where there might be pronouns or dead names in play, right? And for those who are not aware, they're listening to us, a dead name is the original name that your child had that they are no longer choosing to be addressed by.
Hmm.
And I think pronouns can be confusing. There's a wide variety of pronouns. And so I think we are all collectively, I think, on a journey as humans of learning how to address and how to use these new pronouns, how to deal with a society in which people don't check a box. Like that
Hmm.
is new for all of us and we are all evolving. So I think as a parent, it's that sense of curiosity and being on that journey, not trying to take it for your child, but being alongside them, supporting them, and realizing that as things change, it might be hard for you. You have to not expect perfection out of yourself, but be willing to apologize when you screw up. That's really important, I think, as a parent to have front and center.
For sure. And I think
As
that not expecting perfection is important for parents and just for everyone in general, friends, family, society, things like that. In a situation where, just for example, let's say I decided I wanted to start identifying as a female. For the past 21 years, you guys have known me as Cade and known me as he and all of that. So if I decide that, as hurtful as it and frustrating as it can be, there's also a certain level of grace that I think should be given to other people. Because again, you've gone 21 years saying, "Oh yeah, Cade, that's his room." So if I all of a sudden decide I want to identify as a female, that's a hard switch to go from saying his room for the past 21 years to now saying her room. Or if you've called me Cade for 21 years and I decide I want to go by Katie now, that's impossible to expect perfection out of anyone. And that's something I think, and Sawyer, maybe you can relate to this too. I see a lot of people get upset at people although I do think misgendering and, calling people by dead names and things like that is wrong. I think that it's important to identify whether it is done purposefully or whether it is a true accident or a misunderstanding. Because that's something I see a lot in our society, especially with people from my generation, is being so upset that their parent, called them the wrong gender or the wrong name or whatever. But kind of like you said, Mom, that's the name that you picked out as a parent. That's the name that you've identified with your child for the past however many years. So as much of it is a change for you, it's also a change for those around you, whether it be parents or friends or family or whoever. But yeah, that's just one thing that I think there needs to be a certain level of grace with that, but also there needs to be intentionality from the other parties to make a conscious effort to not use those names or pronouns or things like that.
Yeah, and there's going to be times, right, where I think that, especially in the situation of a parent and a child dynamic, right, where there is going to be an adjustment period.
Hmm.
Now, if you're still dead naming your child a year after they've told you to stop using their name, it's like,
Mhm.
okay, you're doing it on purpose now, right?
Mhm.
And so, really, really acknowledging that, yes, this is an adjustment, but also, how would you feel if someone constantly used a different name? Like, for example, my mom, Marcy, that's her legal name. She has never used
Hmm.
Marcia, which is a name she had in the past, right? But if someone just kept calling her Marcia, 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 it might irritate her, right? It would be no different if someone was using a name that you didn't identify with, or Cade,
Hmm.
like I said, like you were saying, if someone constantly said she when referring to you as Cade, that wouldn't
Hmm.
feel great, right? And so
Yeah.
just also kind of acknowledging what that means. And we also know too, unfortunately, that when people are exposed to, using pronouns they don't identify with or names that they no longer identify with, their risk of suicide goes up.
Hmm.
And so really being able to acknowledge the importance of that, and knowing that, mental health is critical. And a lot of this, I think, kind of boils down to the judgment, but also the messaging that a
Mhm.
lot of us receive regarding LGBTQ identities and who we are as people. And I know, obviously, as someone, a gay man myself, who has gone through the coming out process, there is a lot of judgment, not
Mhm.
only on me as a person for being the one who is gay, right, but also, Mom, I'd be really interested to hear what your experience has been as a parent. I know you briefly touched on the fact of like, hey, I don't feel the need to announce the
Mhm.
fact that, like, hey, I have a gay son. But I'm sure you've had people, whether that's friends or people just in your life, who have
Mhm.
said something about it. So, like, how do you go about both navigating that judgment and maybe those preconceived notions?
Mhm.
But then how do you then also like educate yourself to be ready to
Mhm.
talk about those types of things when they come up?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important to me, and this is just who I've chosen to be as a person. I try very hard not to surround myself by people who I would say are narrow-minded. Even if you don't agree with choices anybody makes, right, in their life about a variety of different topics. Like, if you can't respect the fact that everyone has a right to live their own life in the way that they see fit, right, you're probably not in my circle.
Mhm.
So, there are some people who find their way into my circle and I don't know it right away. And when they reveal that, we usually listen. And if that conversation does not help them to see that there is a more open-minded way of living, they probably are not in my circle for very long. So that's number
Mhm.
one is, as a person who this is important to, right? I am not going to surround myself with people like that. I have found that it has enabled me, the fact that I have done the work to try to understand as much as I possibly can about what it must be like to be you, Sawyer, right? And to have
Mhm.
lived in the environments you've lived in, or to deal with the messaging that's out there for kids who maybe haven't come out yet and they're hearing the judgment and the messaging. Sawyer alluded to the fact we live in Kansas. Kansas is a much less accepting place than the Portland area where he is now. And so I've become like I have a heightened sense of awareness to it, right? But
Mhm.
it has helped me to support other parents who are dealing with the same thing. And I think it makes me approachable for them because, I obviously am open to humans of all walks of life. That in and of itself makes it approachable. But when they know that I have people in my life that I love, and not just, in the form of children or other relatives or friends that fall into LGBTQ spectrums or people who are of color, like there's all kinds of people in my life, right? And so I worked really hard to understand. I joined a group called Mama Dragons on Facebook, which has been amazing to help learn the language, learn what some of the struggles are. It's helped me to talk other parents through the struggle. It's helped me to give that to them as a resource. If I've had questions, it's been really helpful for me to be able to ask people who are actually living and I appreciate that openness, right? If I come at someone and I say, hey, I'm really struggling with understanding XYZ about your sexuality, and they immediately close down, right?
Mhm.
That's going to make me less likely to approach someone about that or a similar topic in the future. And so while I truly believe to educate myself, right? Somebody's got to be willing to talk to me about what that experience looks like or how am I supposed to learn. And it's that two-way communication we talked about right at the beginning. And so if you're coming at it from a spirit of I really want to learn how I can support you, I really want to learn how I can be a better parent for whatever the identity issue might be. I think that educating myself has been important, and it is something I did right up front. And I am the first person when I hear someone spewing misinformation or people who are making assumptions or judgments, like I will do my very level best to educate them on the way in which it
Mhm.
is, or to call them out on behavior, or if it is simply removing myself or choosing to not expose my family to people who will act like that and say things like that. Like, if you can't hold your tongue in the presence of my family, if you believe differently, then you will not be invited to the table,
Mhm.
right? Like, to me, it just comes down to being a civilized human being. Like, much like I would do if I joined anyone else's family and my choices were different than theirs. So that, Sawyer, is how I have really worked to educate myself and hopefully have made sure that the judgment and messaging is not felt as much for you when you are in my presence, right? By the people that I surround myself by, and certainly not by myself towards you.
Mhm. And that's why I think, kind of like you just brought up the importance of educating yourself. One, so that way you can be there to support either your kids or your parent or your family members, friends, whoever it may
Mhm.
be that's going through it. But also that way you can educate other people. Although I do think there is a very large problem of people intentionally, either just having negative effects on people of the LGBT community, whether that be aggravating them or things like that. I think that there is a lot of intentionality going on with that in today's society, but I also do think there is a lot of just lack of education and people don't know. um, I think that sometimes that can be used as an excuse, which in that case isn't the best. But there's some people who just genuinely don't know, and there's some people who, just maybe haven't been around people of the LGBTQ community or people of color, or whatever that kind of minority group is. There's people who just genuinely don't know, and that's why I think it's important to give people space to learn if they're open to, and to be open to that. But it's something that has to be reciprocated. If,
Mhm.
just for example, Sawyer thinks that there's something wrong with being gay, no matter how much we talk about it and how much I try to educate him on it, it's not likely that I'm going to change his mind. But if he has just grown up and he wasn't around people of the LGBT community, he hasn't been exposed to that, and he's only really known heterosexual couples, and he says, "Oh, well, what's it like to be gay, or what does that process look like for you?" If he's coming from it from a point of curiosity, then that's a place where you can kind of give someone space to educate them and help them through that process.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think you all kind of bring up a good point, right? Of giving people space and really educating yourself, right? And Mom, I think you brought up a point that I wanted to talk about a little bit, which was about, being able to ask the questions and having those safe people. I think that's really important. And I think it also kind of dives into another topic about just respecting people's privacy and like
Mhm.
who we are as human beings. I think especially within the last 5 or so years, there's been, as you mentioned, Kate, a little bit earlier, a like hyper focus or hyper scrutiny about like, give me a box in which you
Mhm.
identify, like give me an identity that fits you. Um, and I think so often when we're talking about that, we don't have that same expectation for people who are quote unquote straight or quote unquote
Mhm.
typical. And I think the same could be said around, gender pieces or sexuality pieces. It's like you're not walking into somebody's home and being like, okay, who are you sleeping in bed with at night?
Mhm.
Mhm.
What do you have going on downstairs, right? Like those types
Mhm.
of things. You don't just go around asking people like, what's your gender? And so
Exactly.
like there's been this weird like politicalization and almost like hyperfixation around people's
Mhm.
bodies and who they are and where they belong. And so I think it's both respecting that privacy, but what it also is it's really working to like create those safe spaces that we were talking about a
Mhm.
little bit earlier. And um, Mom, I know for you, obviously there must have been some form of fear or worry about
Mhm.
danger or concerns that you had. Would you mind talking a little bit about what that
Mhm.
was like for you? Once I did come out to you, like, hey, I am
Mhm.
gay. What were those fears like, and how did you help kind of navigate those as a parent?
Well, and it's not even past tense. Like, it's not that I did have fear, I do have fear. And especially with, like you said, the politicalization of people's gender and of people's race. And like, I have children of color, also children who are on the Q plus spectrum. Like, I, in multiple ways, like, fear for my children's life on the regular. Like, and some of it depends on where they're at and who they're hanging out with and what they're doing and if they're in places alone, or like, a lot of that is real. It is real and it is there. But I refuse to let that fear paralyze me, right? Like, there are situations where there is legit danger, and in those cases I am going to react like a mama bear, and it's going to come out, and I'm going to protect my kids even though they're grown, right? But I think it's really important to not let fear set us back as a society. People are afraid of what they do not understand. And
Mhm.
proximity, right? Proximity to people who are other than us, who are different than us, right? Can help to build those bridges. And so anything I can do, I think, to help people understand that have not been exposed to any populations other than their own, I think
Mhm.
that is an active way for me to help manage my fear. Because if I can help to educate them, hopefully they are less afraid of what they don't understand. Therefore, my children will be in less
Mhm.
danger. Right now, is this a trip that's going to take us many, many years? We move slow as a society, right? But we have ebbs and flows where things are better and then things are worse. And right now they're worse. And it won't always be this way. And I do have a faith in the greater good of humankind. And I feel like we are on a path towards being, I know woke is a word that will light fires everywhere, but for lack of a better word to understand, when I look at some European countries and how accepting they are and how differently things happen there. When I look at, portions of New Zealand and Australia and some other countries that have figured out a lot of things that maybe we haven't figured out yet in the United States of America, it does make me feel hopeful for the future. So I'm always telling my kids to be careful. Like, I'm a mom. That's what I do.
For sure. There's definitely that sense of fear from a parent perspective, but also from the person who is on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And I think that's something that individually you have to kind of evaluate and decide what level of fear and discomfort you're okay with. And, putting yourself in spaces, whether that be with friends or in a workplace or in communities that are accepting. Sawyer talked about, moving from the Midwest out to the Pacific Northwest and how that, just culturally has been a change as far as acceptance goes. But I know there are a lot of people on the LGBTQ plus spectrum who live in the Midwest and love it, and they live out in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, and that is a life that works for them. I think that goes, for any minority group. If you are a person of color going into a predominantly white space, that is a level of fear and danger that you just have to address and evaluate and figure out, what you're comfortable with. And it's okay to, tell people, hey, I don't want to go to this person's house because they've made comments about my sexuality and that doesn't make me comfortable. Or it's okay to say, hey, I can't be your friend anymore because you support this and that, goes against what I identify as. So there's definitely also a level of fear, as the person identifying. And I think that that is something that, ideally, eventually we would all like to be in a place where it's all accepted and everything like that. But that's just not realistic in, today's society. So just to address that fear and acknowledge it and know that it's there and be aware of it, but be comfortable in it. And I think that that then also kind of goes into, once you have that realization, kind of adjusting and embracing maybe a new outlook on life. I think kind of stereotypically, I think it's very common for parents or grandparents or older siblings or whatever to be like, oh, well, little Timmy, when you grow up and you get a wife, you're going to do this and do that. And, although little Timmy may be 5 and he doesn't know what it means to be gay, once he turns 12, he may be, oh, I don't want a wife, or maybe I identify as a woman and I want a husband, or whatever the situation may be. I think that there's a lot of just natural, kind of like you touched on too, Mom, with the gender reveals and things like that. There's kind of just in society and natural, you have to be a boy or a girl, and then you marry, someone of the opposite sex. So I think kind of mourning and embracing those adjusted dreams and that new outlook on life, and thinking, okay, I dreamed that I was going to grow up in this state, but maybe that's not the most accepting place for me. So let me move somewhere that's more accepting. Or even on a more serious note, I had a dream that me and my parents were going to be close for the rest of my life. And then once I came out as gay, they decided to disown me. And now I have to look at life, without them in it. And although that is sad and you do have to mourn that, and, all of those feelings are very valid, there's also that positive side of it of, although yes, you did lose that relationship with your parents or whoever it is, your parents is just an example I'm using, there's also a positive side of it of, now that is less people that don't support you in your life, and that's less, and that opens room for more people that do support you. So I think just acknowledging those adjusted dreams and being open to them and embracing them is very important.
Yeah, and I think as a kid, there has been, ever since I was little, there's been, hey, you're gonna do this and get married and then have kids, and your whole life is kind of set up in front of you. And even when you're as young as, I could say, like 10 or so, right? You have memories of your parents being like, oh, when you have kids or when you get married. And even as a gay man, right? Like, yes, I could still get married, but having kids looks drastically different for me now, right? And so, like, it's not just a little bada bing, bada boom, I get to have a kid. There's a lot more planning and process that goes into that now, right? And so, I'm sure, Mom, for you as a parent, it has been rewarding but also challenging in ways to like have your dreams that you had for your kid like change. What was that like for you?
I was never that parent that like sat and dreamed about, oh, what my daughter's wedding would look like, and like who you guys would pick out as my daughters-in-law, and what, I did dream about having at least one grandbaby that I can spoil absolutely rotten, and that may still happen, but for right now I've got grandpups that I love to death. And I'll take all of those that I can get. But I think I was never that parent that really had that set of a plan, and kind of, much like we've talked about, like with your educations and those kind of things, like I very much wanted you guys to discover who you were, and I was there to support
Hmm.
you in that journey. But I know there are a lot of parents who have had some very specific dreams as outcomes for their kids. And so then trying to come to that realization, right,
Hmm.
that things might look different than what you thought of. And it's interesting to hear you guys talk about like the dreams of the child, like the things that you thought, and how adjusting those expectations, and I'll make a really strange aside here. So like your stepdad and I have been talking about wanting to move to the southeast corner of the United States, right? Like I have wanted to live at the beach for as long as I can remember, right? All of a sudden, there are massive hurricanes there, and people who live 350 miles from the nearest coast having huge issues from hurricanes, right? And so it's really made me stop and be like, hey, is that really something as an older person that I want to be dealing with on a regular basis? Do I still want to be on the beach? Absolutely. Do I still wish it was a warm beach? Absolutely. But I'm like, does that mean I end up looking at the West Coast? Does that mean I end up looking at Portugal? Like
Hmm.
I don't know what that's going to look like. But again, adjusted dreams, right? I have dreamed for how many years of moving to that area, but it's not only the hurricanes. Like, I am very conscious when I'm looking, I'm like, okay, let's see how this next political election rolls out. And that
Hmm.
may determine where I'm willing to move and what that looks like. And granted, that move is a few years down the road, but it's like I am very hyper aware, right, of how anything I might choose to do might affect my children, even though they're all grown,
Hmm.
right? Like I would always want you guys to feel comfortable coming to visit me, and there not to be added danger and things like that. And granted, there's ways to make sure that you're not in a position where that danger is going to raise its head. But I just think it's really important to be willing to allow your child to discover who they are. And yes, you can have dreams for your child, but those dreams might need to look like, I want my child to be happy. I want my child to have someone who loves them. I want my child to, be able to enjoy their life and follow their dreams and have their adventures, rather than it being, I need my child to grow up and go to college and marry someone of the opposite sex and give me 10 grandkids, right? Like
Hmm.
that's a very old school, very traditional thought process that I think is not applicable for a lot of people who are probably listening to
Hmm.
this podcast. There are people who it probably still is very applicable for, and they are probably not our audience. And we probably lost them half an hour ago when we started this podcast. So, but yeah, that's for adjusting dreams on me.
For sure.
I think it's important for me to communicate with you guys what your dreams are. If you want me to get behind your dreams, you've got to be communicating with me. So that open communication, what are the things you're struggling with? What are the things you dream of doing? How can I help you, right, as your parent, to make your dreams become a reality? So that opens up the open lines of communication. Do you guys have anything that you'd like to talk about on that front?
I just think in general, like keeping those open lines of communication open are what's ultimately going to ensure that you and your big or vice versa not only feel comfortable and safe, but also are going to be able to actually be their true authentic selves. And, our hope always is that you all are able to not only have like the tools and resources that you need to support your bigs, but to also, do your best to navigate through them, even when times are a little uncertain. One last thing I did just want to plug, we did talk about a little bit about folks struggling with mental health issues, or specifically LGBTQ related issues. One nonprofit that I wanted to plug in here is the Trevor Project. They are a specifically focused LGBTQ mental health resource. They do have trained counselors available 24/7, 365 through text, chat, or call. You can reach out to them via text by texting START, START, to 678 678, or you can always give them a call at 1-866 488 7386. Again, that is 1-866 488 7386. And they are trained licensed mental health providers specifically for folks of the LGBTQ community.
Awesome. Thank you
Thank you
for
for
that,
sharing that.
Sawyer.
Yeah.
So today, we've just kind of grazed the surface of healthy family adjustments to LGBTQ plus issues that might come up in your world. I'd like to thank you for joining us, for being open to this discussion. Thank you for being here, Sawyer, and sharing with us, being so open with your knowledge and your experience with our audience. I think there's a lot of people that need extra support and extra information out there as they figure out how to navigate this on their own. So thanks to everyone for listening. I sure hope you'll join us again, Sawyer, down the road. Kay, do you want to go ahead and close us out here?
For sure. Thank you again, Sawyer, for joining us on this episode of Raising Bigs. Appreciated having you. Appreciate having your perspective on as well. But with that being said, that is a wrap for this episode of Raising Bigs. We thank you all for listening today, and thank you, Sawyer, for joining us. We hope that you found some takeaways, a fresh perspective, and maybe even an action step or two in this episode. Above it all, we hope it opens an opportunity for conversation between Bigs and their parents. We are definitely not experts, but we can authentically share what we're learning in hopes of making the path a little easier for those who are listening. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Please subscribe and share with those in your circles who you think might benefit from hearing it. A new episode is released every single week on all of those platforms.
And you can visit my life coaching website at marcyhawkinson.com or email me at lifecoachmarcy@gmail.com. I'm also on Facebook at Life Coach Marcy and Instagram at life_coach_Marcy. Sawyer, where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn at Sawyer Barragan, or same on Facebook, Sawyer Barragan as well. What about you, Cade?
For sure. My handle across all social media platforms is at @Barragan. The best way to contact us, whether you want to give us feedback or ask any questions, is to DM either one of us on social media or to reach out via the contact me page on my mom's website. Again, that is marcyhawkinson.com. Appreciate any feedback, topic ideas, or questions that you may like to share with us. And we will see you next time on Raising Bigs.